Right then, so let's start first with just simply looking your best. Obviously, you're not going to be in the environment you're seeing in front of you now, which is a lovely studio in the city of London, I think that one is. But what you want to do is use the very basics of broadcasting production when you're on camera or on microphone in your video calls or whatever, just to make yourself look as good as possible, and also to project, give the impression that you want to project to whoever you're talking to, whether that's a client or a colleague, or whatever. There are a few key basic things to try and do, and it really will make a big difference. So to start with, I'm embarrassing myself slightly because I'm giving you a very, very good example of the impact of eye level. What you want to do as much as you can, as best as possible, is to avoid looking down at your screen or at your camera, because what you do then is you give the person on the other end a really big up the nose shot. And as you can see here, this isn't even as extreme as it gets. I've had a lot worse in the past few weeks, but people end up really sort of looking quite odd because they've got a double chin, their eyes are really looking down, you can see up their nose. You want to just avoid that. And the easiest way to do it is just to simply raise your laptop or computer or whatever webcam to just be as near to eye level as possible. Now, realistically, you're not going to have your camera right up by your eye level. But what you want to do is just to minimize the amount you're looking down at your camera. So what I've done is I've literally taken 2 or 3 books, put them underneath my camera, underneath my computer, and that's just raised it up on my desk. And that means that my camera is now just a little bit higher and therefore a little bit more eye line level. So that's the first one. And that's a really key one, which so many people, doesn't matter if they're on BBC News or if they're just doing a casual call, make that mistake. They just have it like they're working normally on their laptop or whatever. They've just got it close to their body by their desk and they're looking down at their screen as if they're typing a Word document or whatever. You want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So this here, you're not going to be able to get this kind of level because this was shot on a professional camera. But as you can see, the difference is I'm looking and the eye level is a lot more level for the camera. And so you're getting a nice even shot of me.
Can I just stop you, Rob, about the fact that my camera's right at the bottom of my screen? So
when you said this yesterday, I did think, oh, that would be quite interesting. Unfortunately, you have to, despite that, you have to try and physically move the camera up to eye level. So yes. Part of that, I suppose, part of getting the eye level right is knowing exactly where your camera is on the piece of equipment you're using. So most of the time, 9 times out of 10, a computer laptop will have the webcam on the top of the screen in the center. So you know roughly where the camera is. But for you, I'm afraid you've got it on the bottom left. I have no idea why the manufacturer's done that. Okay. But the principle's still the same. You just raise it up as much as possible towards eye level and avoid. I think you're probably at more of a risk of getting a real up the nose shot because it's
exactly
so much,
what, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, to be honest, just maybe a little bit of a design fault. Okay. But yeah, just try and do as much as you can. The next thing is framing. Now, what you're seeing here is a really simple illustration of what people call the rule of thirds. And that is, you divide your frame, what your actual shot is, into 3 parts. So 1, 2, 3, both forward, both sideways and up and down. So you can see here, you've got 9 separate squares and all those squares are even, and they divide the frame up into even thirds, up and down. What you want to do with your eye line in particular is to have your eyes sitting about 1/3 of the way down from the top of the frame. And what that does is that gives you a nice even look, and it avoids you cutting off the top of your head or cutting off your mouth or nose or whatever. This is, completely arbitrary. It doesn't need to be exactly 1/3 of the way down or 2/3 of the way up, whichever way you want to look at it. It can just be halfway if you want, but ideally this is where you want to aim your eyes to be. So if you have a look at this in practical terms, that's roughly where I did a quick recording. My eyes are roughly or just below that 3rd level shot, and what it means is I'm avoiding the risk of my head getting cut off, and I'm actually also avoiding the risk of my mouth getting cut off at the bottom as well. Similarly, what you want.
A question.
Of course you can.
So but your head is cut off for me now, and I would like to see the top of it.
Yeah, so you have to obviously look at it and see what's being cut off, if anything is. But the principle to go by is just have your eyes 1/3 of the way down. Right. That gives you an even enough look on your frame.
That's better. Move back and see your, but you wouldn't just adjust your camera now so I could see your whole head.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry, you're talking about my live, sorry, I was sort of talking, yeah, so because I'm looking at my screen, I'm leaning forwards a bit, that's the reason why. So,
that's nicer for me.
Yeah, so if I was setting up my camera now,
yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'd look back and I'd adjust it. So about now, my eyes are a third of the way down. And so it looks a bit nicer. I'm looking more proportioned in the screen as well. What you also want to do within the thirds is try and keep yourself in the center of the frame as well, in the center of the screen. Mainly because, as is very obvious, you are the center of attention in your virtual communication. You want to be the thing that people are looking at. And if you put yourself nice in the center, it's more likely people are going to focus on you rather than something off into the corner. They've got something clear and nice and easy to look at. So if you have a look at this in reality, you're probably used to seeing the people virtually patching into shows. So Piers Morgan there, and then these are political commentators, and they're both roughly got decent enough eye level. They've probably been instructed by the producers who called them up beforehand and said, do you mind raising your camera a little bit so your eye level's okay? And then do you mind bringing your camera down a little bit so your eyes are about a third of the way up? And you can see here, and again, Piers Morgan within this frame, about a third, give or take. So that's just an example of where you'll see it within the news as you're watching it now. Okay, so if you're doing a virtual communications piece or you're recording content or just on a call, this is probably you right now, looking at a laptop with maybe a headpiece on or whatever, and this is what you're seeing. Let's just go through some very, very basic things that you can do to improve the quality of how you look within the video. So first one is light. Now, this picture really does explain everything you need to know about light. Essentially, the cameras on your webcam, for obvious reasons, they're not particularly good quality. They're very functional. They're there just to simply show you in a very crude form. And because of that, they're not very good at dealing with bad light situations because they're not good enough quality to have the lens and everything to compensate for it. So what you want to do, or what the consequence of that is if you put yourself up against a light background, you will very quickly become very silhouetted. And by that, it means basically you become very, very dark against your backdrop. Now, the most obvious or most common way this mistake is done is that people put their windows behind them. So they put themselves, when they're setting up for a call, with their windows, with maybe their curtains open behind them. And that means that all the light from the windows is pouring onto their back and it's going to be silhouetting them against their camera. Now, obviously, you want to give your camera as much of a chance of getting a good quality view of you as possible. So ideally what you want to do is certainly avoid putting your back to a window, but also more generally, avoid putting your back to any kind of light source, which is going to cause this kind of silhouetting. So that could be your lights, if you've got lights on. It could be if you're in your kitchen, maybe you've got your garden and you've got a big door opening out onto your garden and that's in your background. As much as possible, you want to kind of flip that situation around and use the light coming in from your windows or coming in from your light bulbs as much as possible to help shine your face, illuminate your face, and give the camera as much information as possible to show you in a really nice quality. So most obvious way to do this within a home environment is just to try and be facing your windows or facing your light source when you're using a webcam, when you're on a virtual call. There is a saying within production, which is the sun and the sky is the biggest light bulb you can get. You know, it's the natural biggest source of light you can possibly use within audio-visual recording. So you want to use that within the home environment as well. So if you're facing your windows, you're letting all that natural light pour onto your face, and that's going to give your camera a good bit of information to use and get a good quality. Similarly, if you've just got a lights on the ceiling or you've got lamps on or whatever, just try and have those facing you so they're helping you and not silhouetting you. That's a really important one. A lot of people get that wrong as well. So at the moment, my camera's not, this is a relatively old computer, so the webcam isn't that good, but what I've done is I'm facing my windows, and that means that I'm using that light to try and bring in as much detail on my face as possible, so that you're seeing me in not a blurry or darkened way. Next one is sound and noise. Ideally, it goes without saying, when you're at home, you want to try and get away from any kind of noises as much as possible. It's very easy to forget about the rumbling noises that you've got going on in your house because you live there, so you kind of block them out. But as much as possible, you want to try and pause the washing machine if it's going on in a cycle in the room next door and it's making a lot of noise. And similarly, you might want to try and move away from windows that are near a road where there's a lot of noise from cars or people who are outside, because you might not notice those things, but the moment you go on a call and people who are not used to hearing them come onto the call, that's a really distracting thing they will hear. It will always be in the backdrop rumbling away. And the problem with that is it takes away from what you're saying. People are going to be starting to, if you get at any point where there's too much noise coming in from ambient sounds, people will stop listening actually to what you're saying and start focusing more on what on earth is going on in the background. So try and do that by moving away from noise sources as much as possible, like windows or doors to rooms where there's a lot of people in or whatever. And then also just try and remove yourself or pause washing machines, tumble dryers or whatever. Similarly, what you want to try and do is try and get the microphone that you're using as near to your mouth as possible, or really as near to your mouth as possible, because what that does is it reduces the amount of, how to explain this, echo and thinness within your vocals. So let's say you're hearing someone from a distance, someone shouting to you across the road. There's a lot of stuff getting in between them, their noise, and your ears. So there's a lot of what's called ambient noise. It's going to have to travel quite a long distance to get to you. And as a result, their vocals are going to come across as echoey or distorted. It's the same principle for using a microphone as well. The more distance you have from the microphone, the more stuff you're allowing to get in the way of your vocals and the microphone, which is of course what's recording your voice, and therefore perhaps the more distorted or more muffly your voice is going to be. So the most obvious way and the cheapest way to get around that and just to have a nice clear vocals is to use your headphones, because as you can see here, my microphone is right next to my mouth, which means that my mouth's words, the sound waves coming from it, are having to travel a relatively small amount of distance before they're getting caught by the microphone and getting transferred over to you. If I had this microphone on the other side of the room, for example, you would hear me really muffled and really echoey and really what's called full of ambient noise, which distorts it and makes it hard to hear. So if you can plug in some headphones, either use something like this is great. If not, what I've got is absolutely fine. And make sure you're using those, because it will just make your vocals clearer. And there's a rule which a lot of people don't realize. Vocals and sound is as important to video as the actual video itself, as what you're seeing. So if you've got it doesn't matter how good your camera is and how well you look, if people are really distracted by what's going on outside, the noise is coming on outside, or the fact that they can't quite hear what you're saying because you're really muffled and they can't make out every other word, it doesn't matter. So try and make sure you always use a microphone or headset if you can, and just remember, have it close enough to your mouth so that it's a nice clear recording coming from you. Okay, let's cover confidence and presentation. So these are some tips from me, really, from the broadcasting that I've been doing, and also just more generally some industry-wide tips to make sure that when you are having to present something or you are having to deliver some kind of communications virtually, you're doing it in a nice, clear and clean way. So the first thing is, this is new for everyone, this whole world of virtual communications. And there are many people who are having to learn a new skill. So don't be intimidated by the fact it's new, and don't feel like you're behind or one step behind everyone else, because no matter what stage of management, or whether it's a big company or a small business or whatever, everyone's having to get used to this. So everyone is, very supportive of the fact that some things might not go to plan the whole time, and this is all new to everyone. In terms of actual practical steps, if you have a look on this screen, I've put forward here my script of a piece of video content that I prepared where I had to deliver it live. And as you can see here, I've got my subject heading at the top, and then in yellow, I've got 3 subject areas, and then I've got the next topic in green. Now, this is called the rule of 3, and this is what I find as a really helpful way of remembering and keeping a structure of what you're doing. What you want to do is let's say you've got something that you want to say, and you know that you've got to cover certain topics or certain information. Try and split up what you need to say into 3 clear parts. obviously going in the order that you want to say them. And write them down. And don't write them down in long scripted ways where you have to read from them. Just write them down into clear subject bullet points. And then within that, give yourself 3 little prompts. Again, just a simple 4 or 5 words, nothing more than that. Just things where you can read it and you know exactly what it means. Ah, yes, I remember where I'm at now. What this will do is it will give you structure to what you want to say, and it will mean that you don't forget anything, but it's also easy to recover where you left off if you lose track of what you're saying. So for instance, if I lose track and I know that I've done my welcome, I know that I'm on my second post. Oh yes, all right, overarching principle. I know exactly what I need to say now. If you start preparing stuff with too much content, with too many lines of words, I guarantee you when it comes to actually trying to use those prompts in a live environment, it will be really hard for you to try and find where exactly you were and what you want to move on to next. So to some extent, simplicity is key. And you want to try and do that by using a rule of 3. Just try and keep a discipline to have 3 points. It's also, if you get into the habit of using 3 bullet points, it then becomes part of your routine. It becomes a structure that you're comfortable with and used to. And the more you're able to keep to a structure, the clearer and more confident you're going to be able to present, because you're comfortable within the framework that you're delivering content. Similarly as well, prompts. There is nothing wrong with using prompts within your presentations, or if you're having to say something. Some people feel like it's bad form to have notes or whatever. Absolutely not. I'm using some notes for this. What you want to try and do is avoid looking down at your notes too often. So for instance, if I was delivering this whole presentation like this is a particularly unengaging way to talk to you, because you feel like you're not really connected with me because I'm not looking at the camera. And it's not a very engaging or dynamic way of presenting. So what you want to do is just have these bullet points, which you can glance down at occasionally and just remind yourself where you're at, and then make sure you look back up at the camera when you're presenting. One thing that a lot of people, even though they've done all this preparation, even though they've got this rule of 3, is that they get very, very worried because they don't know what they're going to say first. They don't know their opening line. And so what I'd always recommend as well is just rehearse, or at least know the first thing you're going to say, the first sentence you're going to say. Because in the moment when you have to deliver whatever content you're having to, needing to say, if you know what the first thing that comes out of your mouth, it gives you a good starting block from which to then continue on. It gives you a bit of a confidence boost because you know you're delivering a first line. You know exactly the first thing that's going to come out of your mouth. Sometimes when people have prepared what they're going to say, they haven't actually thought about their opening statement, their opening line. And it means that all of a sudden when they come to actually having to start their presentation, they don't know their exact starting point or how they're going to say it. So always have maybe practiced a couple of times your first line before starting a presentation. The benefit of that as well is if you do a nice, clear, clean, and confident first line, it means that it's a nice way just to start your presentation for your audience as well. They're feeling like they're knowing exactly what you're doing and that you know exactly what this presentation is going to be about. Final thing then is presentation techniques. Actually, I don't know if I included this on the presentation. Let me just go up. Yeah, so there are a few Zoom tips that you need to understand. There's some Zoom etiquette that's come about from the past few months, a couple of months of doing this. First one is when you join a call, try and mute yourself when you join. What that does is, if you've got a lot of noise in the background or you're practicing something and you join a call, let's say you're joining a call which is already halfway, which is already 10, 20 minutes in, if you don't join muted, all of the noise that you're bringing in is suddenly going to flood the meeting and disrupt the meeting. So if you can, as much as possible, the moment you join a call, mute yourself and then unmute yourself when you have to talk. It just means as well that if someone comes barging into the room, making a load of noise in a house, as it happens in a house, you're muted, so it doesn't matter. You're not going to have an embarrassing moment where everyone can hear what's going on in your house or whatever. That's quite a key one, and it's quite funny. Some people get quite annoyed at the amount of times they get interrupted during their presentation by people not muting themselves. Look at the lens, as I've been through that. Hands, I've used them a fair bit, but avoid using your hands too much, because as you can see, if people start doing this loads, it's incredibly distracting to watch. So if you do want to use your hands, just use them as you do naturally, but just be aware to not have them in front of the camera as much as possible, because it just means that it's less distracting for people. Finally, smile. Now this is, to taste really, to personality, but you want to try and keep things lighthearted, and people respond well to people who are generating a warm image. So smiling is a very good way of just giving someone a nice warm person who they're talking to, and it relaxes the situation a bit as well. So it might feel a little bit artificial because you're not actually talking to someone, but as much as possible, try and smile. You see this with presenters on professional TV. They'll be as miserable as they want, beforehand, and then the moment they've got their cue, it says, "Okay, we're going live in 3, 2, 1." The moment they hear 3 or 2, they suddenly go, and they just start smiling, because it means the first frame that the audience is seeing is a bright smiley face. So you want to do that as much as possible, and it just helps generate that warmth and gives a nice relaxed feel to the whole webinar or piece of virtual communications you're doing. One thing which I didn't cover, which is worth just saying, is about backdrops. You're at home, so obviously it goes without saying, just remember, only have in your backdrop what you want in your backdrop. And similarly, that might be, having in your backdrop the things that you want your audience to see or client to see, whether that's a bookshelf or just a plain white backdrop as I've got here. You can also, and I just want to show you how to do this, you can also put virtual backdrops in Zoom, for example. So for example, here we go, I've done this. And what that does is, this is the technology that you've got nowadays. You can, if you've got a backdrop which is particularly embarrassing, or you don't want it in the backdrop for whatever reason, you can actually cut it out through Zoom's virtual backdrop. You do that by going to the bottom column where it says mute stop video security participants, and you go to video, and there's a little downward arrow, and it says choose virtual backdrop, and then it opens up as a separate window, and you can choose a virtual backdrop. It's unfortunately, I think when I share my screen, I can't then show you how to do that, so I'm having to rely on explaining it to you. But once I've stopped sharing my screen, I'll try and share the actual window and see whether I can show you properly.
Rob?
Yeah.
I do a virtual background. Look.
Oh, there you go. You've done it.
Yeah, but look, we go pixels.
Yeah. So this is where it has its limitations, and it does unfortunately depend on the camera you've got. So and also again, it goes back to light and the information you're giving your camera. So if your camera's for whatever reason not the best quality, or it's not got enough information coming into it to identify you from your backdrop, then you'll start getting very pixelated. And that basically means that the computer's camera is not able to detect where you start and your backdrop ends. So it's getting confused basically.
Okay.
So as you can see here, it's not, for whatever reason, the Zoom is not able to 100% work out where your face begins and the backdrop and your backdrop begins. So it's sort of pixelating you out slightly. Again, it might be the quality of the camera, but it also might be a bit of light. If you get a little bit more light in there, it will start bringing the details of your face in a little bit more, and then Zoom will be able to work out a little bit better where you are and where the backdrop starts as well. Just to say as well, if there's, I've done a video series on effectively everything I've just covered, which is on YouTube and everything on these links. So if you want to watch back specifics about recording audio or video, just have a look at those, which are on you. They're free and they're easy to watch. And that might be, if you're getting stuck on something in particular, that might be quite helpful for you. And they've got slightly more visual prompts and ways of explaining things as well.